I would like to present Lisa Minardi. Lisa is currently the director at the Speaker's House in Trapp, Pennsylvania. She's the author of A Colorful Folk, Pennsylvania Germans and the Art of Everyday Life, and is a scholar of Pennsylvania German art and culture. She will present Pennsylvania German Redware this evening. And let's give Lisa a warm welcome, please.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you, Kelly, for the introduction. Thank you. Can everybody see this okay? Are the lights okay? Or do we need something else turned up? Is it possible to turn it on at the back?
Yep, turn it
and
on.
Off up front? There, how about that? Okay. I tried to bring my best photos, so I want to make sure that they really show. But of course, as many of you saw, we do have a number of pieces of redware up front, and I want to thank all of the collectors who brought pieces along tonight so that everybody got a chance to look but not touch up close at some of the pieces. And some of them are in the talk, and then a whole lot of other examples. So the way that I've organized the talk, just to give you a little bit of a roadmap, we're going to look at different types of making and decorating Pennsylvania German redware. So we'll talk about slip decorations, sgraffito, modeling, pierce work, things like that. And then we're going to look and sort of some case studies at the work of particular potters, where we have signed pieces, dated pieces, and you can really start to build a group then around those folks. And I do want to say right at the outset that while I have long loved Pennsylvania German material of all sorts, looking at redware is a relatively new field for me. I've mainly worked with Fraktur and furniture, and I brought a sampling with me of the very few studies that have actually been done so far of Pennsylvania German redware. And the one and only book on the subject dates to, I think, 1905 or 1903. The first edition of that came out. So it's clearly long overdue for new study, and so I hope that this will build into a future project. So, first of all, let me just introduce you to one of the rooms at Winterthur Museum, Henry Francis DuPont's home and a museum in northern Delaware. This is the Pennsylvania German Folk Art Room. So it just gives you some sense of the sort of massing and the display of all of these beautiful redware plates. But of course, nobody in the 1700s and 1800s actually lived with their house looking like that, with all of these dishes, crammed onto the shelves, and no pewter, no spoons, no nothing, just redware. But that was Mr. DuPont's, decorating philosophy. So I just wanted to, kind of convey the collecting side of it before we look at the historical. So first of all, if we exclude the most basic redware, which has no decoration at all, just plain red clay with usually a lead glaze that was applied and then fired in the kiln. The kind of first step for decoration would be slip-trailed decoration. And slip is simply a creamy liquid clay, often a whitish color, but as you'll see, it can be other colors. And so that would be, you'd use a slip cup like this, a little handheld device that would have a well on the inside of it, kind of like an inkwell, where that liquid clay would be poured by the potter. And then usually several goose quills, or maybe just one, or this one has 3, sticking out the side of it. And then that would let you flow the slip out of that cup and onto the plate that you were decorating. After the slip has dried, sort of air dried, and you put the lead glaze on it and fire the plate, that's when it turns that yellow color. It's from the lead glaze. And so if you look at a lot of reproduction pottery today where they're not using a lead glaze, it's much harder to achieve that really bright yellow color on those pieces. So looking at this plate, you can see these 4 kind of undulating lines. So we can tell that the artist had a 4-part slip cup, that he was able to make all 4 of those lines at the same time. This plate is on view up front, and just an absolutely spectacular example of slip trailing, again using a 4-trailer cup. And so he was able to just go, and kind of scroll it across the top and then skip it across in the middle. And so all of that was done with the slip cup. And then the only other decoration was adding some of these splotches of green which was done with copper oxide, just ground up chunks of copper oxide that they would just sprinkle onto it for a bit of color. And you wouldn't see the green to the naked eye until it was fired, and then it took on the green color. So this is an example of just a single tube slip cup. This one is also on view up front. And this one is particularly kind of ergonomic, if you will, and it has these sort of pinched in sides so that you can actually get a pretty good grip on it. Because imagine, today we display it as an artifact, but imagine if you were the potter actually using it and you've got wet clay and slip and, a messy work table and you're just trying to work as quick as you can. So anything like that could make it a little bit easier to hold this while you're doing your decoration pretty quickly would be helpful. And this one is also nice because on the back side, we actually have the initials, presumably of the potter, because this would be a piece they typically would make for themselves. So we have a WM, and then the date of 1866. And for you Redware fanatics out there, it's been suggested to me maybe this could be William Mettinger. I don't know. He's the potter of that date who fits those initials. But if you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them afterwards. And then this was just recently brought to my attention, and this is also on view up front. This is a 3-color slip cup is the idea here, which is completely unique in my experience. And so the potter actually incised the clay before it was fired using Pennsylvania Dutch with the names of the 3 colors. And so I have it transcribed here. So this top one is for white, the word Weiss, and then here we have green for green, and then Gale, which would be for yellow. So, of course you could put different colors in them, but clearly he's trying to mark out what the colors would be. And then he could do 2 lines in each of the colors, or you could also use some clay and just plug up the holes if you didn't want to use that particular tube that day. And so here's some examples where you actually have some slip trailing done here in black, and then the white turning yellow in the kiln. And then this one is a little deceptive. At first you might think it's green slip trailing, but again it's that copper oxide pigment that's being sprinkled on the top of it after the creamy slip was put on. And then just showing some more variations of, these slip decorated pieces can get quite elaborate. So with tulips, here's a piece that has sort of these rainbows on it, where they were using several different colors for the slip. This one's dated up here, 1790. So it doesn't have to just be a plate. It could also be a hollowware vessel like that crock with its lid. And then you can also have pieces where it's just completely writing that's done using the slip trailing. And so for this, you have to have pretty good control if you're trying to not just make some squiggles on there. And you'd be using a slip cup like the WM one that we saw, where it's just a single tube for the trailing. And so this is one, a very well documented piece, because the potter put his name at the top for Simon Singer, potter as his occupation, and then he puts his location in Appleboxville in Berks County, Pennsylvania. Okay, so leaving slip decorating behind then and turning to sgraffito. So the word sgraffito, it comes from an Italian word that literally means like to scratch or to incise. And so that's exactly what the potter is doing. They've made their plate, in this case a very simple plate that would be just rolled out the clay with a rolling pin. You'd have what's often called a hump mold or a drape mold. You'd take that piece of clay off your work table, drape it over that mold, let it air dry to that shape, take it off of that. You'd have your cream colored slip, pour that all over the inside of it, get a good coating there. Again, let it air dry somewhat, and then you take a sharp tool, maybe even a sharp goose quill or something, and you would cut through, you'd incise right through that layer of the cream colored slip that had dried, and it reveals underneath the red clay that you had coated. So you have to do all of that before the piece actually gets fired. And so this is a well-known dish that's in Winterthur's collection. Unfortunately, it's a pretty singular object, so we don't know who the potter is or even where, really, in southeastern Pennsylvania, this piece was made, at least to the best of my knowledge. So starting to look at some documented pieces now. These are 2 plates, one of which is on the up front, both made in 1808 by the same potter. But fortunately this one, he included his initials, A.H., for Andrew Huebner, who was a potter in Berks County. And showing, fairly similar design. They both have the tulips at the top, these 4 petal flowers at the sides, but then, a completely different motif being used in the same year by the same potter. The one on the left, this great big parrot here, looks to me like it's coming out of probably frock tour art. You see that a lot used as decoration on the manuscripts and birth and baptismal certificates. And it's not uncommon that potters would be looking for design inspiration at pieces like frock tour. So the sgraffito plates, they can often have somewhat lengthy inscriptions, usually running around the perimeter. And these can be fairly humorous at times. So I've transcribed or translated this one here. And the potter is saying, "Maiden, I can tell that you would like a husband. As far as I can see, you will soon be getting one." 1821. And so, perhaps this was a wedding present or a, engagement piece or, clearly for a young woman of marriageable age that was getting that plate. Sometimes they can be a little bit nasty. We'll see some of those too later. Now this plate is on view up front, and I had never seen it in person before tonight. It's actually quite a small little eating plate, but particularly interesting where it has this octagonal pattern to it, copying fancier imported wares made probably in England, creamware or pearlware plates. But the potter, copied the shape of those, but then sort of did his own thing with the design. And he put this great big bird using sgraffito in the center, and then for good measure he labeled it Vogel, or bird, at the top and dated it 1796. And so this is an example of a sgraffito piece where it's just a naked clay. There's no slip, there's no coloring, it's just that red clay being used, all the sgraffito being done, let it dry, glaze it, and then it went into the kiln for firing. There's another type of decoration that is not very common, for lack of a better term, of which I'm not aware, I'm just calling it sort of carved decoration. So here you have a thrown pot with a lid, and it was allowed to air dry, but then they went back in there with some kind of a scooping tool, almost like a little carving tool, and took away little scoops of clay to get this design. So going horizontally around the perimeter and then vertical marks in it. Then they went back very carefully and filled each one of those little scoops with either a yellow or a green slip. So a lot of work would have gone into making a piece like that, and then you hope that it survives the firing in the kiln after you put all that effort into it. A simple type of decoration that you see on a lot of pieces, which might be slip trailed or sgraffito or other means, is just a coggled decoration. And so that's referring to this coggled edge that you see usually around plates, which was made with a tool like one of these wheels. Some of them are little wooden wheels that kind of just look like a gear. The one at the bottom there is actually a Redware wheel that the potter made for himself and glazed it and fired it. But after you had your plate ready to go, you would just roll that around the perimeter and it would indent the clay, kind of like making a pie crust where you're going around and pinching it or decorating it. You could just use that kind of roulette wheel and give it that nice coggled edge. Another type of decoration, again, not quite as common, but this sort of molded and applied decoration. And so this is a piece that's signed on the bottom by Andrew Huebner. It's dated 1851. We saw a little while ago his 1808 plate, so this is much later in his career. But he was able to throw this flower pot on the wheel, and then all of the decoration is made by having a set of molds that he would have squished clay into them one by one and removed it, and then put a little bit of slip or wet clay on the back, and then just stuck them onto the sides of the flower pot, let that dry, glaze it, and put it in the kiln. So it looks very fancy, but when you start to look at it, you can see that he only had about 4 or 5 different molds, and he just used them multiple times and kind of alternated the figures around the flower pot. And then some potters, just for fun or whimsy, would make pieces that were like little figural sculptures. And so these are just some samples. These are pieces from Winterthur's collection. We have a couple on view on the table that were made by the Briner pottery 20 or 30 years ago. So this was definitely a tradition that continued for many years. And sometimes the pieces, I'm not sure if that little bird is or not, but sometimes like the tail will be made into a whistle. So they can also be a toy for children. Here's another example of just this sculptural work. This is a particularly early one, dated 1798. It's this figure of what's known as a pelican in its piety. Often in Proctor, when you see this, the pelican, it's a mother pelican, and she's pecking her own breast to get blood to feed her starving little babies that are in a nest with her. And so it's this symbol of Christian self-sacrifice that gets used in artwork, often in Proctor, but extremely rare that you would see that in Redware. And then probably getting the most complicated are pierced work vessels. So these are actually double-walled vessels. Imagine if you wanted to use that as your sugar bowl and it has all these holes in it. You have to have a solid container within the pierced one to actually hold the contents. So it's complicated to make, and then they have to go in there and cut that decoration out, outline it in the colors. This one has some little sprig molded decoration that was either kind of stamped on there or perhaps molded separately and applied. And again, you put that in the kiln and hope that it comes out the way you want it to look without having collapsed or broken, because they're pretty delicate. Here's an Inkwell Stand at Winterthur. Actually, there is the pelican in its piety with the little baby pelicans with it. But this is a piece that it's kind of scary to even pick it up because of all the parts that have been cut away. It's quite fragile. So imagine being a potter when it's not even fired and trying to handle that piece when you're making it. And then another type of decoration that's also kind of unusual, I'm just calling it resist decoration. But basically, the potter went out and gathered some leaves from outdoors, put them on the plate, and then dumped it into the slip. And so the slip wasn't able to go. It was resisted by the leaves. And then you could put it in the kiln, and the leaves just burn off, and you're left with the red color there. And this one is signed by the potter. Conrad Renninger is his name, around the rim, and then dated 1838. Here's another example of his work where he used a little leaf here, but then it also looks like he might have used like paper cutouts or some kind of template that was put in the clay again to create that resist technique for the slip decoration. So now I want to talk about sort of some of the uses of redware. We've looked at a lot of the ways that it was decorated. But all of these pieces are basically utilitarian objects, whether or not they have decoration. And so I'm just showing some incredibly plain pieces here that would have been common in most Pennsylvania German households. So things, crocks like this, they could be used to store apple butter or milk or any number of materials. That one is glazed on the inside, so the liquid contents can't get out. But notice the outside of it is unglazed. So if you had, if you were lucky enough, you had a spring, let's say, in your cellar, you could set crocks like that in the spring, and the cool water would get in, cool the contents, but it wouldn't, get into the liquid and ruin it. So that was one common technique. And then just things like colanders, pie plates, all number of objects. Cooking molds, baking pans, you also see in redware. These fish-shaped molds were one popular type of mold, but then these sort of kind of like the older version of a bundt pan, sometimes called a Turk's head mold because of the shape. It's kind of this turban-like shape. We have an example of one of those up front. But you could just put your cake batter in it, put it right into the bake oven, have it bake, and then bring it out, just like we would today with a modern bundt pan. Here's another type of redware piece. When I was a student at Winterthur in the master's degree program, I came across this piece when I was taking the ceramics block, and it was cataloged as a mixing bowl, which I thought was a little odd. And how would you mix in this oblong thing, and why did it have a pouring spout, and why did it have a handle? So I started researching the piece. I also noticed, it was incredibly blackened on the outside. There was no glaze on the outside, so all these things suggesting it wasn't a mixing bowl, but what the heck was it? And so I was looking through different cookbooks and books on Pennsylvania German food, and I saw a picture of one of these illustrated, and it was described as a roasting pan, and that you could put meat and vegetables and other food in there, put a pastry crust on top, and then it was, shoved or slid into the bake oven across on its flattened bottom. And so the handle would facilitate, that you could hook it with something and then pull it back out of the bake oven if you wanted to check on it or if it was done cooking. And with the spout, you could pour off any liquid or fat or whatever from the contents that you wanted to get out of there. The way that they were made is they would have been made essentially in a pair. You would throw a cone-shaped cylinder, and then it would get cut in half and split, and then with the rest of it being worked and the handle applied, so that they'd be able to make 2 of these roasting pans for every one that was thrown. And the blackening reflects that use in and out of the bake oven. Another, just great utilitarian example would have been roof tiles, made out of a brick-like clay. It basically gives you a fireproof shingle material. And so for things like a bake oven, or even houses or smokehouses, barns, lots and lots of buildings had clay tile roofs originally in German-speaking areas. And so here's just a sample of one. We have some clay roof tiles up here. They are, rolled out flat, put in the oven. They have a built-in, what in German they call the Nase, the nose, this little projection on the back. And because you can't, nail on a clay tile, so how is it hung? Well, it's just a gravity hung system. And so that little nose acts as like a hook that it just rests on your horizontal shingle lath, and then you're able to install the roof that way. So very common for bake ovens, but also lots of other structures. Here's a sample of just a typical, very plain roof tile. Here's that little Nase or lug that projects out the back, usually about an inch or so. But note the finger grooves that the potter has put on it in this sort of a tulip shape. And so what that does, if you imagine, a row of these, shingle upon shingle upon shingle, the water gets concentrated to the middle via those grooves and then pours into the middle of the next shingle and is able to run down the roof fairly efficiently and without getting between the shingles. Here's a very decorated shingle. Occasionally you see this in clay tile. This is one in the Winter collection, and I've transcribed the inscription here. It's probably one of at least a pair of roof tiles because it has a partially unfinished inscription. But it has the date 1763, and then it says, have I, Johannes Feistenauer, and then presumably the other one would have said what he did. He built his house or, did something. That the story continues. So I just briefly have started looking into, well, who was this guy? Can we pinpoint where he lived? And I found that there was a Johannes Feistenauer who married a girl from Reading, Salome Winter, in 1764. So that, could fit with the idea that he was, getting married, building the house around that time. So some more research needed, but it would be great if we could actually prove that this, was a Berks County roof tile, and an early one to boot at 1763. Another just totally utilitarian function, were flower pots. Just like today, you go and get your terracotta flower pots from the store. This was a bread and butter kind of thing that potters would have been making. Sometimes with the saucers actually attached to the pot, and then sometimes made as 2 separate pieces. Here's just a tiny little pair of flower pots. These are about 3 inches tall, more of a whimsy, but just to show you another example. And then some really kind of unique forms that you occasionally see in Pennsylvania German redware. So this is a really beloved piece at Winter, a redware teapot. Usually something you would see in porcelain or creamware or some kind of fancier ceramic. But here, the local potter made a teapot and inscribed around it, here's the translation, but saying, God bless us in food and drink with this date of 1799. Unfortunately, the lid is missing, so it's been gone for a very long time, so that's why there's no lid. And then I also started digging around and found actually 4 or 5 examples of these little tea caddies or tea canisters for holding loose leaf tea. They all seem to be the work of the same potter. They have this cross hatching on the shoulder, similar dates, in the 1790s. And so I'm interested in trying to gather photos of them together and, line them all up and see if, are there any complete names on them or anything that we can get a little bit further. And then here's another very unusual piece, a so-called quintal or a 5-fingered vase. Again, a form that you would normally see in a very fancy imported ceramic, but here being made by the local potter. And here's just some examples in pearlware to show how they were usually imported, usually fancier, but then used, usually on a mantelpiece that you could use them for display. Another type, instead of looking to England for inspiration, you also see some Chinese influence occasionally in Pennsylvania German pottery. So here's a plate probably from, I would guess just looking at it, probably David Spinner, a Berks County artist, but there's a pagoda on the middle of this plate. So he probably was looking at a piece of Chinese export porcelain and decided to copy the design onto that plate. And then another kind of custom piece, a barber bowl or a shaving basin, so that cutout part would be put against a person's neck to catch the beard and everything as they were shaving. And then you can see the inscription around it, "Come, sir, and have the shave which you no longer need to crave." That's the English translation, attempted to make it rhyme, which it does in the German, and then 1774. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears into these sort of mini case studies, looking at the work of particular potters. And so the earliest of them I'm starting with, and that's George Huebner. He is a German immigrant. He settles in the upper Hanover area of northern Montgomery County. And one of the things I just love about George Huebner's work, in addition to how it looks, is that he very often dated his pieces. He sometimes included the owner's name, very helpful. And he sometimes signed his work, very, very clearly. And so that's the case with this plate. This had been in Lester Breiner's collection, and it's on view up at the front of the room as well. It's a plate that, originally would have been a very special presentation piece to the recipient. As it kind of became old-fashioned or, fell out of favor, it got used as a baking plate. And so that all that blackening is from it being used in the bake oven instead of as a nice display piece. So here's a transcription of this very lengthy inscription, but it says very clearly, this dish was made by George Hubener, 1792. So you can't ask for more than that for a signature. And then it has a biblical verse from Matthew. Then it comments on the design. There's a bird here, and saying, "Surely no hawk will seize this bird because the tulips bend over it to protect it." So he's describing the design. And then he has this kind of crazy sentence where he says, "The kraut is well pickled but badly greased. Master cook." So you can get these really kind of wacky inscriptions going around the rim. Here's another plate which is attributable to Huebner. It's dated March 6, 1792. And this is a saying Huebner uses a lot, but he's kind of cautioning the owner. He's saying, "This dish is made of clay. When it breaks, the potter laughs, because you have to buy another one. So, take care of it. Why don't you?" And you see that phrase over and over. It gets repeated by Huebner quite a bit. One of the distinguishing things about Huebner's work is that it's earlier, and so we tend to see that his plates are all actually thrown on the wheel rather than drape molded over a form. And so here's the reverse side of the Huebner plate, and you can see the concentric lines, which tell us that it was thrown on the wheel. And then he used some kind of a wooden edge or scraper to give it that rim versus just the convex drape molded type of plate. Here's another Huebner one. This is 1785. A sort of ditty about marriage and procreation, saying if it's not for men or roosters, the cradles and hen houses will all be empty. So, you know, they can be a little bit earthy in the inscriptions. But also, you know, here you have this beautiful stem with these 3 huge tulips coming off of it. And just to show, you know, this is, of course, not just limited to Fraktur. So you see it on tombstones, on Fraktur. Here it is on an iron stove plate. Here's a little sulfur inlaid chest. You know, so it's just very common motifs that the potters are creating. Here's another one. This is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art collection. And this is one where he included the full name. So Katerina Rader is the woman's name, 1786. And then it says her plate or her dish. Out of the earth with understanding, the potter makes everything. And then he included in great big Fraktur letters here the GH for George Huebner. And just to show, you know, the Fraktur alphabet for a second, you know, I think I particularly like George Huebner's work because his penmanship is so incredible. You know, there's nothing sloppy at all about this. And when you think, you know, he's not writing on paper with the full pen, he's having to incise that into the clay, you know, pushing clay out of the way and removing it as he goes along. So here's the GH in the capital Fraktur alphabet. You know, and if you compare those G's and that H, you know, he's pretty spot on in his writing, and the rest of it compares very well. There's some contemporary potters to Huebner who are copying his sayings, copying his designs, and often their pieces get attributed to Huebner, but when you look at the handwriting, that's always the giveaway. They had pen, you know, their penmanship just doesn't hold a candle to Huebner's. So here's another one. He used that same phrase about men and roosters. This one's 1787. Again, you know, he's using that bent over kind of peacock, preening peacock motif. This one has Magdalena Young's name, 1789. And then this is a saying he also used sometimes saying painted flowers are common, but you know, it's up to God. God alone to give them a scent. This is the only other piece that Huebner, to my knowledge, actually signed in full. I showed that dish at the beginning where he said made by George Huebner potter. This one, he also, here you see the G, and he signed it around the rim. It's also one of the only known hollowware pieces by him. Mainly what we have are the plates and then this one other piece that survives. But no doubt he would have made, you know, plain things, you know, all sorts of utilitarian stuff as well. These are the pieces that were saved probably because they had dates and people's names on them and were so decorative. Here's one more. This is one in the Winterthur collection. Susanna Stelz was the recipient, 1789. Thanks to findagrave.com, I was able to run her down a little bit. This is actually her married name. She was about 36, 37 years old when she received this plate, and she's buried in Gilbertsville in one of the Lutheran graveyards in that area. This piece also is significant because it's been published before, you know, years and years ago in some of those very early Pennsylvania German studies. And I'm not sure if the people writing that either couldn't read the inscriptions or, you know, were just ignoring them. But they were described as, you know, marriage dishes and lovebirds with that double-headed bird motif. But, you know, when you bother to research who Susanna Stelz was, you know, she's not a newlywed. She's in her late 30s when she gets this plate. And George Huebner clearly says, you know, here is pictured a doubled eagle. You know, it's not a lovebird. These aren't turtle doves. It's an eagle. And what they were looking at, you know, here you see it again, same inscription. And another one with the same inscription. But here we go. And what I want to get to is, again, the double eagle. But here, you know, this all goes back to the Holy Roman Empire with the double-headed eagle. So Germany was part of the Holy Roman Empire really until, you know, the Napoleonic invasions in the early 1800s. So this was a symbol, you know, that German-speaking people knew. It's something that they would have brought to the New World as well with them. And if I just back up for a second here, this is what I'm talking about in terms of attributing plates to Huebner. So here's an example of his work, absolutely exquisite Fraktur lettering. Here's another one. But then here you have an artist, you know, emulating that double-headed eagle, trying his best with the handwriting. But it's just, you know, it's clearly the work of a different potter. And we don't know yet, who that is or if it's more than one person, because there's quite a few pieces out there that are these sort of Huebner lookalikes. And then I was just showing this as an example of, in Huebner's same neck of the woods, this is a fantastic Mennonite frock tour that was made by an artist named Andreas Kolb, and he put this great big double-headed eagle at the center and also labeled it the antler, like an eagle. So we know, again, he was intending it to be an eagle. Okay, so here's just one other Huebner plate with this unique inscription on it, talking about that there's no plaster or medicine that can heal me, and so looking forward to getting from this crazy world into heaven. Okay, so jumping now to a different artisan into Berks County, Pennsylvania. So this is one of the only known signed pieces by David Spinner, who's a contemporary of Huebner's, and he put his name down here, D. Spinner, and the date 1801. You'll see in the next several slides with Spinner's work that he very often used images of people on his plates. So a little bit different. Some of them look like soldiers, such as this guy in uniform. Here you actually have a drummer and a fifer, and then two men here carrying muskets, and he wrote in English, a shoulder firelock. He's describing their guns. Here's one that's sort of a two-part series, it looks like, where you have this chase going on with a man and woman on horseback, and then this horse is almost leaping off of that plate and sort of starting to appear onto the second plate, and then you see the hounds who are chasing after this deer, and this inscription, deer chase, that's up there at the top. Now keep an eye on the way that the antlers are on that deer, sort of arcing up into that shape. And then you have the same type of antlers here on this deer. And so this is another kind of set, but we don't know if they were made that way or just that he was kind of doing the same thing with the inscriptions. But the one on the left being inscribed in English saying the buck asleep, 1787, and then on the right we have the fox asleep. So whether or not they were made as a pair or just same day, different design, we're not quite sure yet. Here's Hansel and Gretel. He's labeled this sort of handsome, adult-looking couple. So if he hadn't called them Hansel and Gretel, go figure, who would have known? But he likes to put people on his work. And then here's a conversation going on between a man and his wife, or his betrothed, and she's speaking to him in this sort of thought bubble coming out of her mouth, saying, "You've been a dear man to me ever since I first looked at you." And you can kind of imagine, like David Spinner giving a plate like that, to his wife or something, as a little kind of repartee going on between the two of them. And then sometimes he didn't include people, he just did floral designs. So this is a beautiful plate, absent people, but with beautiful flowers, and that one is on view up front. Okay, so also in Berks County, I'm going to another potter who sometimes signs his work, but often includes a date. So you'll see several dated pieces, and often with this motif of sort of a big flower pot or vase at the bottom, with flowers springing out of it. Done using sgraffito with the slip decorating, and then that green, remember, coming from sprinkled on copper oxide. Here's just variations on a theme, so the same basic design being used, but you can see how different it is, with the copper oxide being added on the left, and then also these dark brown, that's probably manganese sort of splotches that the potter put on before it was glazed. Two more examples. And I'll just back up. There's one very similar to this, but dated 1810, that's up here up front as well. And then occasionally, these oval sort of loaf dishes, they're often called, were made by Mumbauer. So here's two examples of that, but pretty clearly when you look at like how those pinwheel flowers are done, and then come and look at the oval, but it's clearly the same potter at work. He also made some hollowware vessels. Few of them survive that still have their original lids, but so here are some examples. And on this, you might be able to see in the photo, not only did he use the sgraffito technique to incise the clay, but then he went back with a red slip and actually kind of filled in to get a really bold contrast of color in the area that he had just carved away. with this tool. Okay, so now Berks County, one of the best known sgraffito potters, certainly from Berks County, is a little bit younger than the potters we were just looking at. He's not born until 1787, but that's Solomon Grimm, who worked in Rockland Township primarily. And he used sgraffito technique, but also used that filling. And so all of this sort of bright orange color is not actually the red body of the plate, but it's where he went back in and filled with this brighter red color. He also uses a lot of copper oxide and a lot of manganese, which is giving that dark brown contrast as well. Grimm very often made plates of this type, which are slip decorated and where he put a heart at the bottom and with dates usually in the 18 teens on them. He very rarely, I can't think of an example where he included an owner's name, but he did actually sign his work a few times. And so it's a little hard to see, but here on the back side of this plate, you're scratched into the clay with some kind of sharp tool before it was fired. He wrote his last name, it just says Grimm. And then he also used like this green slip as the ground for the plates, which is something pretty unusual in Redware, and we have an example of that up front as well. Here he used a dark manganese ground to give this brown background where the yellow and the red really pop out in the color. There's another manganese one. He also labeled this one, in addition to 1820, it says number 9 in size in the clay. And we don't know if that's referring to the size or one in a series or something. They're pretty rare to have one of these, and none of the other ones are marked that I know of. And then here you see one where the lid of it actually survives. And so it has, here's this great big starburst pattern and a very similar design. If you were to look straight down in the lid, you would see that as well. And then this is a strange little piece that lives in a desk cabinet, normally at Winterthur. It's dated later than Grimm's usual work, 1832, but I think, comparing it with all the other plates and the hardware pieces, that it very likely is by Grimm, or if not him himself, maybe an apprentice or somebody that he trained that was really familiar with his work. Not even totally sure what it is. It's kind of the size of a tea caddy. It necks in and has that tiny little projection at the top with this tiny lid, but then it has a great big handle on it as if it was some kind of drinking vessel. So we're not quite sure what its original function was. Okay, so jumping back now towards the Montgomery-Berks County line, we have a sample up front of Samuel Troxell's work, and he is another researcher's dream come true because he very often signs his work and dates it. And so on this piece, he has his initials on it several times, ST. Here he put S. Troxell, 1828. He was very into politics at different times on this pottery. So here you see an American eagle and the word liberty. Keep that in mind because you'll see that appear again. But he also made at least some hollowware pieces. So here's a flower pot that he signed and dated also in 1828. So at the same time he made the plate, he's also making a piece like this. And it has the owner's name here, Michael Cope, bought of Samuel Troxell, this flower pot, 1828. So here's the one that's on view up front, and this is one of my favorite inscriptions as well, where this exasperated wife is saying, well, I cook what I can, this is the best I can do. If my pig won't eat it, my husband will. So, if you don't like it, go get your own dinner. And then he includes his abbreviated name here, so there's an SA for Samuel, TR for Troxell, HE for Huebner, or Potter, and then the date 1833. But Samuel wasn't done with this piece. He also inscribed on the back of it, before it was fired, again repeating, Samuel Troxell, Potter, Upper Hanover Township, Montgomery County, January the 25th, 1833. So, very specific, that we know exactly when, where, and by whom this plate was made. And to make it even more exciting, this is a plate he made the same exact day. Also 1833, and here he was in his patriotic mode or political mode, and so he has Liberty for Jackson, spelled with a G, and so this is for Andrew Jackson when he's campaigning for president with that same date. And then with this humorous inscription around the rim that if loving were injurious to health, the doctor would avoid it. And if it hurt the maidens, they would not put up with it, basically. Two more plates, no, there's the two side by side that were made the same exact day. So different decoration, totally different in their inscriptions and themes, but same day, same powder. And then here's that saying again, apparently this was popular with his customers, about from the cook, but this one's 1846, so 11 years later. Now jumping to Lancaster County, we haven't looked yet at Lancaster. But a favorite potter, and one that we do have some documentation for there, is a man named Solomon Grimm. And so we've also moved into the 19th century now, because he's born in 1802. So this is just a very simple little wheel-thrown flower pot, but then it has molded decoration of this bird and little leaves and a stem and berries that are all applied to the side of the flower pot. It's only about 5 or 6 inches tall, so it is fairly small. Here's a larger flower pot also made by Solomon Grimm, and this was a presentation piece that he gave to his wife Sarah. And so it may have been when they were courting, because here you have this great big cat, the little bird on the branch, and then he has ready for a catch, that the cat's going to pounce on the bird, this idea of maybe getting engaged or married. And the inscription, if you look closely at those letters, the thought is that they were actually done with letterpress type, that the potter somehow had access to these letters and pressed them in the clay before the piece was fired. So maybe he had horrible handwriting and he wanted to make sure Sarah got the message. I don't know, but it's a pretty unique example to his work to see that letterpress inscriptions. Here's some more examples of his work. These pieces were made well into the 1800s, but they have these much earlier commemorative patriotic dates on them. Unfortunately, he inscribed them, because I'm not sure we would know that that was Independence Hall otherwise, but here it is flying a flag. And then he has the dates, 1732, that's when construction began, 1741 when it ended, and Edmund Woolley was like the master builder, the architect for Independence Hall. And then the one on the right, this is supposed to be George Washington here in his knickers with his sword, whacking the Liberty Bell, I guess. With that sword, but it has Washington's name at the bottom, and then it says in Pennsylvania Dutch here, the Liberty Bell, 1776. So our best guess is that these were probably made in the 1820s. It would have been the 50th anniversary in 1826 of the Declaration of Independence, so there was a lot of kind of commemorative memorabilia that was being made, and he probably jumped on the bandwagon with that. And then to go back to Berks County for a minute, a potter named Daniel Shen Felder, working much later than you might think, just to look at a piece like this, this decorated wall pocket. But he's active in the last third or so of the 1800s, working right in Reading. And one of the things that's really interesting about him is he works in both redware and stoneware clays. So this is a earthenware wall pocket. Here's the stamp on the back of it, D.P. Shen Felder, Reading, PA. But that same exact stamp appears on some of his stoneware work as well. And so once stoneware clays get discovered, particularly out in western Pennsylvania, because stoneware is a stronger pottery, it's less likely to break on you if you drop it or have it in the hearth. And also, you don't technically have to glaze stoneware for it to hold liquid. Whereas unglazed redware, the water will seep through it, but with stoneware, you technically don't need to. For things like being able to clean it easier, there can be more practical reasons. But so he works in both materials. And then jumping into the 20th century, one of the last known of the so-called traditional redware potters, the end of the line, is Jacob Bettinger. His father, William, was an immigrant potter. They settled in the Limerick area of Montgomery County. Jacob learns from his father. And here's some examples of his hollowware pieces. And then he also made some sgraffito plates with an artist named William Mcallister doing the sgraffito work for him. But take a look, he's clearly copying earlier artist pieces. And he's not doing these plates until like the 1920s is when Mcallister and Menninger begin this. And so by that time, we're into the colonial revival period. Publications like the Index of American Design are starting to come out. And so there's actual, visual access in the form of printed images of pieces like this, along with that early book on Pennsylvania German redware that I mentioned. It comes out in 1903 or 1905. It's so early that the images in it aren't even photographs. They're actually like charcoal drawings and pencil sketches that got reproduced. But Menninger would have been able to look in books like that and make his own replicas. Here's just another example of a plate where he was clearly copying David Spinner's work in his own. And then just to bring it even further into the 20th century, of course, Lester Breininger, I'm sure is a name very familiar to many people in the room. So Lester, of course, continued with this traditional Pennsylvania German redware for many years, and now the Robisonia redware pottery continues that. But then also just another potter of many that I could have mentioned, Greg Hubener out in Ohio. One of the kind of unique things about Greg's work is that he does continue to use a lead glaze with his pottery. He marks it, very deeply on the back, so you can't like file off his marks and pretend that they're original pieces. And also, because it is a lead glaze, so it's not considered food safe. So he makes sure to mark that on there. But he really does achieve a very, rich yellow with his colors, because of that lead glaze. And I just wanted to part on a few quick words about historic trap material, because this will tie in with redware, I promise you. In the town of Trapp, which is celebrating its 300th birthday this year, we have a number of historic sites which are open to the public, the Muhlenberg houses, Augustus Lutheran Church, and this wonderful tavern building. And we have an exhibit on at the Henry Muhlenberg House through the end of the year, where you can see lots of period pieces of redware on view. Also the Speaker's House, the Frederick Muhlenberg House. But here's just an example from the Archaeology Field School program that we have every summer, where we find literally, tons of pieces of redware. Beautiful slip trailing, some sgraffito, some very plain pieces as well. Also some English earthenware that they seem to have been importing. And so we've begun cataloging these pieces, cross-mending them, gluing vessels back together. But Trapp is also, we've discovered, home to a redware kiln that predates 1750. And we don't know yet who the potter was, but the kiln foundation is literally about 5 feet from the wall, the outside wall of the Henry Muhlenberg House, which is built around 1750. And so clearly these two structures didn't coexist. So the kiln has to predate the house. But archaeologically, they found all sorts of kiln saggers and wasters and broken pieces in the excavations. So we're hoping with more research to actually figure out who this very early potter was working there in Trapp. We found a lot of clay roof tile pieces archaeologically, like you see on the bake oven here. And so we're actually now reconstructing a bake oven and using clay roof tiles that actually came from a generous donor in the Oley Valley. We just brought those, about 200 of them, back for the bake oven roof to go on. But here's where it particularly ties in. So that Dewey's Tavern building is the headquarters of the local historical society. And we're starting to talk about ways to do some changing exhibitions and sort of refresh what's been on view in that building for, frankly, a very, very long time. And what we're thinking about is doing a redware exhibit probably in 2020. We're talking about Proctor for 2019 and then redware the following year. But we would exhibit the kiln artifacts that were found in the archaeology dig. And then we would show a lot of work of documented redware potters. And so tentatively, I'm referring to this as from Huebner to Menninger. And both of those men worked about 5 miles or so from Trapp, or even closer in the case of Menninger. So we have a very early documented redware potter with George Hubener, and then going forward into the 20th century to Jacob Menninger, and hopefully, as much as possible in between the two of them. So I hope that you will come visit us for that exhibition, if not beforehand, to see some of the other things of the Muhlenberg houses. And we're happy also, if you ever wanted to come and look at artifacts or see the archaeological pieces or the kiln stuff, we're always happy to do tours by appointment as well. So thank you all very much. I know you all just really want to look at the redware. You're probably sick of hearing me talk up here. Yes, Ron Cook.
You had some of the later, you didn't mention stall. You better well know, that's before there.
Yeah.
The reason that is
I had 98 slides in my PowerPoint, and so I decided enough was enough. So I just drew a line and said, okay, I'm done. So, but stall definitely on my radar, and we have access to some pieces for the exhibition as well. But yes, just arbitrary. Yes. Well, you're sitting next to the auctioneers who sold part of the collection. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mentioned the Hubener plate up front was in the sale. That was the sale at Cook and Cook. That came from Leicester. Okay. Here we go. Any other questions? Oh, yes.
all these plates up here are so obviously from this area. You go down the south, here's Redware, it's maybe, you have trouble deciding if it's American or European. You always pretty much the same.
Right.
You never see anything in Europe. Maybe that's Berks County, maybe it's Alsace Lake, it's like Berks County. So why do you think we have this tradition, it's just like, so obviously from here, or in other parts of the country, it just sort of flowed in. Like I said, it's very similar to both places. You ever thought about that?
Right, well, I can hazard some thoughts, I'm not sure how accurate they are, but the North Carolina redware, there has been some more significant studies and archaeology done the past couple of years, maybe 5 years ago by Chipstone, there was this big exhibition. So one thought would be, a lot of that pieces are coming out of a Moravian context. The Moravians have a lot of communication back and forth with Europe, and people coming and going all the time, including trained craftsmen. So is there just literally more connection and communication with the old world? That's one thought. Now you might say back to me, well, gee, Lisa, there's Bethlehem and places in Pennsylvania where there's Moravians and potters. But to my knowledge, the archaeological work has really not been done in those places. I'm not even sure if there's anything left really to study. I've heard that Bethlehem doesn't have where the pottery was. I think it's been all developed and bulldozed and stuff like that. So there's not intact kiln sites to go looking for that. But one of my hopes in doing this redware exhibition and hopefully a catalog with it that we're thinking of would be to really focus on the documented, signed, initial whatever pieces, and really try to pinpoint these are the works of these potters in these counties, and try to establish baselines and benchmarks, because you often see pieces being said, oh, well, this is Berks County, that's Berks County. Well, that may be true, but how do we go? I always like to go back to the documentation. So anyway, I hazarded a guess towards your question. We'll see where it goes over the next few years. So, yes.
Have you done any research on the Passmore pottery?
The Passmore pottery.
Sebastian Days?
That's a name I'm not recognizing. Eastern Berks. Passmore is a Quaker name in Chester County. Is this a German pottery or is it Quaker? Do you know?
I don't know, but his pottery wheel is in the Reading Historical Society basement.
Oh, okay. The redware that. Yep. I know the wheel you're talking about. And is it Passmore or is it?
Well, it was Sebastian Days had the pottery, but it was I guess it was known as Passmore pottery.
Okay, maybe it changed hands a few times then.
Well, the road there is named Passmore.
Passmore. Okay. Well, that piece is on my radar, and it was something, I don't know if it's possible to get it out of that basement, but it was, on the wish list for the exhibition to think about, to include an actual, documented potter's wheel.
The pottery was right next to Grand New Steamboat.
Wow. Okay.
That's where the local, that's where it was at.
Okay. Yeah. Was there a hand somewhere in the middle? No? Yeah.
Where does Gerald Yoder fit into this whole
Where does who, I'm sorry?
Gerald Yoder, Oley Valley Pottery.
Oh, I'm not, yeah, I don't know. That would be part of, finding documented potters and then trying to find words that we can put with them. So.